I'm going to talk about a deck building rule to follow. I think something that will help players starting out if they want to improve their deck building. It's gonna sound like a meme, but it's really not. Okay, so I follow this deck building rule called the 70-30 rule, and it kind of like came up one time during like a testing session with one of my buddies, and where I was jokingly saying like I feel like every deck I play, I have 70% engine, 30% non-engine. Essentially, let me show you an example. In a 40 card deck, you will have 12 non-engine. You see right here, for every 7 cards, the 7 engine cards are here, 3 non-engine. Every 7 cards, 3 non-engine. I know like there are some decks that do not follow this rule. Runic just breaks every rule of deck building. I feel like Runic is like, it's an anomaly. But I feel like this ratio is really nice because if you guys have watched my video on why you're not performing, one of the things I talk about is building decks without having attachments to certain cards, right? If you play a 40 card deck and you have 12 non-engine, you have a really high chance to open 1 and a really solid chance to open 2. This math is not perfect because it doesn't account for duplicates, okay? But I would say on average, you have about 45 to 48% to draw 2 non-engine. If you draw like Talon's Thrust, you draw like Imperm Veiler, Ash Nib, stuff like that, right? I feel like that's really solid because I think the way that modern Yugioh has evolved, it is really hard to win games without non-engine. There's a few exceptions to this rule, but the decks that are playing all gas, no breaks, like Tier Elements and stuff like that, that tries to break your board with just engine going second, those type of decks are like super gamba. And what I mean by that is like they have to literally try to sack you to win. When I say non-engine, I would say about 70, like the 30% being hand traps are typically very good because if your deck isn't that powerful, being able to stop your opponent and having them make a weaker board is like really good. A good example with this, like my Infernoble deck, right? That I took through like 2 YCSs. I knew that my deck was weaker going second, but it was good enough into half boards. So I always tried to like have a lot of hand traps because if I can stop them from making a board or have them eat the hand traps and make a half board, I knew that I could play into it. Right? But I knew for a fact, like a huge percentage, that if my opponent even combos me a little bit, I would never be able to beat them. And so I like made sure to fit in hand traps to combat that. And obviously there are exceptions to the rule where like if you play like an all gas deck, you can maybe play like less non-engine where you play like 85-15. So you would play like only 6 non-engine, which is 15% of a 40 card deck. And then you would have more engine cards to like, you know, beat your opponent because some engines are really, really powerful or good enough to like go second into most boards. But I think that depends on the format. Like I feel like the format that we're in right now before Phantom Nightmare, you can get away with less non-engine. Like I honestly think you could play just 6 because a lot of the decks don't put up an oppressive enough board in the format. But I think post Phantom Nightmare, you will need a minimum of 12 non-engine, whatever deck you play, guys. Trying to break Fire King boards, if you guys watch my video off of like what one Snake Eye Ash can do, you will quickly understand that it is very difficult to break that board unless you like can stop it early enough and choke it early enough, right? You'll see that even like my Snake Eye deck, like my Fire King Snake Eye deck, like I play 12 non-engine at a minimum. You see that? 70% I like to be engine because when you go into like Kashtira levels of non-engine, and what I mean by that is like when you start playing decks like Cash, which is like 50% engine, 50% non-engine, you will brick a lot of your games. Like you will not be able to play a lot of your games. And I feel that like you don't win with just non-engine, you win majority of the time because of your engine. So you need to be able to play the game too, right? If you guys watch Jujutsu Kaisen, you would know that this theory is pretty sound, right? Because when does Nanami crit against his opponent using the 7-3 rule? If you watch a lot of anime, you actually become better at Yu-Gi-Oh! That's just how the rule works. No spoilers, but we won't talk about what happened to him. Yeah, I just consider this like kind of like the golden ratio in terms of like deck building. You can get away with like 60-40 only in certain decks that have a multitude of 1-card combos, but for the majority of decks that have like not a lot of 1-card combos but a bunch of like 2 cards or stuff like that, you're gonna really want 70% of your engine. It's just like I believe the most optimal ratio at which you can like play every game but then also have enough non-engine to combat your opponents. The thing to note is that even if you play a little bit more than 40 cards, as long as you follow that ratio that I talked about, I think it's fine at the end of the day. The only difference between playing 40 and more cards like 50 or 60, the only difference is you just see your more powerful cards less because not all cards are weighted the same. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if you want to see draw, playing more cards will make it so that you will see draw less, but you will still see the same amount ratio wise of non-engine. So that also has to be in consideration. Is there a specific non-engine that you need to draw? In which case, if that's so, then you would want to stick to as close as 40 as possible. But if it doesn't matter what non-engine you draw, as long as you draw a non-engine, then it doesn't matter how many cards you play, right? I think that's going to be kind of like the key takeaway in terms of like how you do it. Yeah, most people play 9, but the issue with 9 is that like a lot of decks in the format don't lose to 1 non-engine, they lose to 2. Therefore, like you kind of want to play 12 because it gives you that 50% chance to high roll a chance to draw 2 hand traps going second. And that's really, really important. You kind of like are, and sometimes you'll have to play decks like that go in, like if you play 18 hand traps, you have odds of like drawing 3 hand traps. The thing you have to understand is that like stopping your opponent is half the battle. The other half is also being able to play the game. Being able to play the game requires you to have also some semblance of engine cards, right? Like you can't just win the game going imperm draw ash. That doesn't actually end up winning you the game completely. You need to also have cards to play the game. That's kind of like my thoughts on it, and I'll probably cover this in another video, but when it comes to siding, I never side out engine. So what I mean by this is like your non-engine in your main deck should typically be the amount of same non-engine you have in your side deck, except for matchups that are against FTK decks or like against decks that like first turn win. Then you will have to side out engine for non-engine and go to like 15-18, because in those scenarios it's like if you don't hand trap them, you lost the game, right? So it's kind of like you kind of have to like do that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's why Circular was so disgusting, because Circular or Mathmech was able to hand trap you 3 times and open a 1-card combo that played around hand traps. That was so disgusting. I never saw Connector going second. Connector was too good. My example that I can give a really good example with my Infernoble deck. My Infernoble deck had 12 non-engine in 44 cards, but I sided out all the equips because the equips were engine requirements. They weren't technically engine. They were engine requirements, which means they were bricks that I had to play in order to have my deck become functional when it went first. But when you went second, I sided out all the equips and I put in more non-engine because I want to maximize the chances of seeing stuff going second, because my deck is weaker going second. By playing 15 non-engine and 45 cards, it had that 7-3 ratio that I was talking about. You know what I'm saying? I hope that kind of helps and helps it make sense for you guys. I feel like if you follow that, your deck is just inherently automatically a little bit better. Obviously there's a little bit more nuance, but that's like the quick dirty rundown.